Come on, Daddy needs a livable planet he can rule with an iron fist. This is a quote from the season 9 episode of The Big Bang Theory released in 2016 called the Sales Call Sublimation, an episode that is largely noteworthy, at least for the purposes of discussing studios and advertising, for being about 18 minutes long despite being a show that was specifically made to fill a half-hour time slot. A time slot that quite literally had, over the years, slowly become about half advertisements. More specifically, the Sales Call Sublimation clocked in at exactly 18 minutes and 34 seconds long, when you take into account the length of the title sequence, about 22 seconds, and also the credits, which tend to be about 30 seconds. The episode actually clocks in at about 17 and a half minutes of actual content, which for an episode of The Big Bang Theory is just enough time to get close to their maximum quota of one joke that vaguely hints at being funny per episode. For comparison's sake, the first episode of the show clocked in at 21 minutes and 56 seconds long. This means that between 2007, when the show premiered, and 2016, when the 9th season was underway, episodes of The Big Bang Theory got about 3 to 4 minutes shorter. Noteworthy in all this, networks also tend to run ads during credits, as well as often making use of things like banner ads during content, so calculating the exact amount of time a viewer was having their eyeballs bombarded by advertisements is very difficult. Now, it's easy to dismiss this because, well, it's The Big Bang Theory, and who really cares about that show? But this has been an observable trend for decades, with basically every major network staple getting ever so slightly shorter with each passing year. For example, newer episodes of The Simpsons are roughly 2 to 3 minutes shorter than they were back in the 1990s. Meanwhile, newer episodes of Grey's Anatomy, aka One Piece for soccer moms, similarly run about a minute or two shorter than they did when the show first aired in 2005, which seems kind of odd given audiences in the 1990s were much more captive to what was currently being shown, and on the whole had longer attention spans than today. Of course, there can be legitimate, creative, justified reasons for an episode to run slightly longer or shorter than its normal average runtime, like ending on a cliffhanger or the like, but as noted, this is a readily observable industry-wide phenomenon that is generally blamed on advertisements. Not to mention that when shows do run over or under time, it tends to be by a few seconds, and in those cases, shows have numerous tricks they can use to pad or cut the runtime to reach the required length. For example, arguably one of The Simpsons' most memorable jokes, Sideshow Bob stepping on 9 rakes in a row, was a direct result of the episode in which it appears, Cape Fear, being too short when an initial edit was completed. According to the creators, in the initial cut, Sideshow Bob was only supposed to step on 1 rake, and as a result, Kelsey Grammer only did 1 take of the iconic groan that the character makes. To pad the episode though, they decided to instead have the character step on 9 rakes, reusing the same sound effect and take he recorded each time. In the director's commentary for that episode, the showmakers reveal that there were other ways they could have padded the episode, but decided on having Sideshow Bob step on 9 rakes when they calculated that this would be the exact amount of time it would take for the joke to stop being funny and then start being funny again. And as someone who remembers that episode when it debuted live, it was indeed hilarious and came painstakingly close to this then 11-year-old host peeing his pants by the 9th rake. Keeping with The Simpsons, other ways they could pad for time during the show's heyday was by simply using a longer couch gag, since this wouldn't require any significant changes to the episode itself. The most notable among these being the so-called circus couch gag, which features the family dancing in front of their couch as the room is pulled away, revealing an entire circus complete with fire breathers and dancing elephants. This was a specific, very lengthy couch gag the showrunners would make extensive use of throughout the show's early run whenever an episode was about 20 seconds too short. Now, for anyone curious about why they didn't just do this with the Cape Fear episode, they did, and it was still another 20 seconds or so too short, hence the rakes. On both counts, we applaud them for not simply sticking another advertisement in to fill most of the gap. Instead, we got the hilarious rake gag. Something worth noting on the intro couch gag is that while this trick could be used to pad an episode's runtime in a seamless, non-intrusive way, it could similarly be a way to create more space when the show ran too long, and anybody who's watched an episode of The Simpsons likely recalls at least a handful of episodes where the intro credits cut immediately to the couch gag. The Simpsons is by no means an outlier in this regard, though it is arguably one of the most noteworthy examples, and most network shows will have truncated versions of their respective intro in case they need to add more time for an individual episode to breathe. Where they definitely aren't going to take this time from, however, is advertisements. On that note, the only reason the shows classically needed to do this is because the networks they are on have a very specific amount of time to fill for each time slot, which itself can vary depending on the value of said time slot to advertisers. For example, a show airing at prime time will likely have more ads run against it than one airing as a rerun at 3 a.m., although there are exceptions where back in the day, if they could find the sponsors for it, running more ads against such nighttime content could work as well, as we all had approximately 5 channels to pick from, and a couple of them just ran colored bars and a solid beep tone at night, or the other go-to of nighttime TV being just one big ad in an infomercial. But the point being, in all, no internet to turn to distract our brains from ever being idle, at which point we might find ourselves in the dangerous state of thinking our own thoughts in our heads. Those were dark times, my friends. Numbers-wise, in the US, this means in modern times, the average for primetime network television being anywhere between 12 to 17 minutes of dedicated advertisements being beamed directly into your eyeballs per hour, at least according to stats published in 2025 by Statista. Which honestly, that average figure is a lot lower than we would have guessed and makes the aforementioned Big Bang Theory example even more egregious. But in any event, the discrepancy being the result of different networks having different standards when it comes to this, with the worst offender, again according to Statista, being the A&E group, who air things like Hoarders and Cold Case Files, closely followed by Paramount Global, who produce things like NCIS and Criminal Minds, with both running in excess of 17 minutes of ads per hour of content on average during their primetime hours. This now probably has you wondering if there is a legal limit, like the FCC or something must have rules in place that would tell a network they must have more content than ads, right? Well, not exactly. In fact, the only real hard rule the FCC has in place about this specifically relates to children's TV, in that, to quote, children's television programming for an audience of children 12 years old and younger can feature no more than 10.5 minutes of advertising per hour on weekends and 12 minutes per hour on weekdays. There's also a bunch of extra rules about what exactly can be advertised and a whole lot of nuance thrown in that we won't get into here, but the overly simplified rule of thumb is that it cannot be something that would be inappropriate for such an audience or tries to directly sell them stuff. However, no such rules exist for shows aimed at adults or even teens, and as a result, the only thing preventing a network from adding more ads than they already do is the fact that we, as an audience, find ads really annoying. Most of the time anyway. As in, under the current regulations, a network could, if they really wanted to, run nothing but ads 24/7, with the only thing really stopping them being that, if they did, nobody would watch. Except that one episode of Linus Tech Tips where they did just that, making the entire video nothing but segues to genuine sponsors, and it was hilarious. Also, any ad their former employee Dennis, who is now working for and getting ripped on Jeremy Ethier's fitness channel, wrote, "I'm watching. Dennis is the Rembrandt of advertising." And note, Jeremy's channel is also extremely good for those wanting to have their meat sacks more meaty and maximize chances of existing to see Skynet enslave us all. But back to ads. The thinking then, at least as far as we understand it, is that regulation isn't needed because there's a certain point where viewers would just change the channel, and as such, networks are largely allowed to set their own standards and to try to find where the limit of what we'll put up with on a given show is. And hey, the more ads also means less production time and money needed for the actual content, which is now shorter. And on that note, think about the episode of The Big Bang Theory we mentioned at the start of this piece. I mean, normally I'd never recommend thinking about The Big Bang Theory because The Big Bang Theory, but work with me here. Maybe take some anti-nausea medication if needed. But according to the figures we could track down, in excess of 15 million misguided people somehow watched that, and save for a few people on Reddit who never matter, and a handful of trade publications that almost nobody reads, nobody seems to care that the episode was almost 50% advertisements. Those 15 million people simply enjoyed the core content enough to put up with the rest. And listen, we don't judge, only make snarky remarks. You like what you like, you do you. Maybe also get therapy too. Things become even more stark when talking sports. For example, in American football, a given game tends to have around 15 minutes of something actually happening, despite the broadcasts of that game tending to run closer to the ballpark of 3 hours long, with countless sponsors weaved in every way imaginable, even to the 15 or so minutes of the gameplay action itself in some ways. but the peak action is entertaining enough and the way the rest weaved in that few complain that only about 8% of the time you are watching, something is actually happening. When also factoring in things like fantasy teams, gambling, and the bastion of quality journalism that is sports talk radio and TV, with definitely and in all ways the best and brightest humanity has to offer, overanalyzing every facet of everything for hours on end, day in and day out, often in nonsensical ways, no doubt making you question the future of humanity in the process, which also has copious amounts of advertisement interspersing it all. This arguably makes things like NFL games the most lucrative and advertising dense 15 or so minutes in all of entertainment, with, in all, sports being the best illustration of the ultimate life lesson that everything is pointless and nothing matters, but we find our own pointless enjoyments along the way, and sharing the experience and meaningless ups and downs with others in our tribe is super fun too. Even if that tribe are the Seattle Mariners, destined to always lose, never competitors, but always protagonists, as so poignantly noted by John Boyce in arguably the most watched and best non-Ken Burns baseball documentary of all time, The History of the Seattle Mariners, which is available here on YouTube for those interested. It's extremely good. But going back to advertisements, there's nothing to stop networks from making insane amounts of ads the standard, save for the fact that we'd notice and stop watching if the entertainment value didn't pay off the given advertisement time for a given form of entertainment, which varies depending on what exactly you're watching and your particular interests. A sentiment that probably has you thinking, well, I'll just watch old shows then when seasons were more than a handful of episodes and the episodes themselves were rather lengthy, which networks are not only aware of, but have been surreptitiously shortening for decades. For example, we found an example of networks in the 1970s, half a century ago, which is a time notion you should definitely not dwell on, speeding up old episodes of I Love Lucy just to fit in more ads. The network in question, WNYW, would then use a harmonizer to pitch shift the audio down so that it sounded correct. Other networks don't even bother doing this, reasoning that audiences either won't care or won't notice. For example, TBS were found to be speeding up episodes of Seinfeld by around 7.5% in 2015, a move that shortened an average episode runtime from 25 minutes to 22, enough time saved to fit in roughly 6 more ads. But it's not just old sitcoms either. Networks have been caught, or in some cases admitted to doing this to movies too. For example, TBS again were caught speeding up showings of both The Wizard of Oz and the original King Kong movie from 1933 by a few percent, simply so that they could fit in more ads. In each case, they neglected to even bother correcting the audio, making King Kong sound less like a 100-foot tall killer gorilla and the Munchkins sound, well, or Munchkin-y. Weirdly, despite being a well-known industry practice for decades now, it's something that occasionally even surprises the actors who appear in these shows and movies. Something we say because we found an interview with Courtney Cox talking about how she thought she was going insane while watching an old rerun of Friends because she didn't recognize the voice coming out of her character as her own, with the actress admitting she had to look up what was going on, and it was then she learned about the practice of speeding up shows to make more room for ads. Other, more insidious ways networks have cut down shows and movies is by simply removing sections wholesale. Admittedly though, sometimes this can have an understandable justification, like say editing curse words or violence out of an R-rated movie to air it at an earlier time of the evening, though it's worth noting, these changes are generally also made to appease advertisers who are generally averse to anything that might be even remotely controversial. But of course, sometimes these removals are just to cram in more ads. More! This can get as specific as editing out individual frames or cutting a half second of dead air when, say, a joke has just been told. Because as every comedian knows, you never want to pause after telling a punchline to let the audience process and fully enjoy the joke. Perhaps more insidious still is to simply run ads while the show or movie is airing, usually via the inclusion of banner ads across the bottom of the screen, which themselves have been a thing for decades, usually being used to advertise upcoming shows in that block of programming, but more recently have become worse somehow with the creation of overlay ads designed to work in conjunction with things like smart TVs. As you might expect, networks are very interested in the implementation of these things, in part because studies show that viewers perceive them as being less intrusive than a traditional ad, even if they're exposed to more of them during a given piece of content. In essence, you'd be more willing to consume fecal matter if someone embedded a small amount of it in a giant bowl of chocolate ice cream. Sure, it might detract from the experience of the ice cream a little, but it's a better way to eat crap than just a spoonful of crap with no ice cream. In regards to overlay ads, streaming services are notably the frontrunners in this regard, and there's a not insignificant amount of industry frustration with the overall resistance consumers have historically shown to advertising on these platforms. For example, consider a 2024 article published by Ad Exchanger, a site that, as the name suggests, is primarily aimed at those in the advertising industry, which note in negative terms how, to quote them, roughly 78% of US streaming subscribers believe they should never have to see ads if they pay for a service. Shocker. The rest of the article goes on to note the various ways that streaming services can still advertise to this majority in spite of their objections. For instance, the article speaks highly of the idea of pause ads, basically a static ad that appears whenever a user pauses their stream for whatever reason, with the article noting how these ads are particularly effective specifically because, to quote, they don't feel like ads. And don't even get us started on the practice becoming more and more prevalent on streaming services you pay for of the second the credit starts, switching to an advertisement or a new show to keep you watching, or occasionally an error that happens before the credits, cutting off the final scenes of a movie or show, requiring you to reload and fast forward to the end, then lightning quick select to watch credits just so you can see the end of the show you've paid to watch. Seriously, a skip credits button is fine and even helpful in some cases, but credits should be the default, not skipping them and having to select watch credits. The credits are there for a reason. Now before we move on, going back to ads that don't feel like ads, this brings up one of the beautiful ironies about advertising. Countless studies have shown that the most effective ads are ones the consumer doesn't think of as an ad. Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean it's subliminally slotted into a show or anything nefarious like that. It just means that a consumer sees value in the ad beyond its intended purpose of advertising a product. For instance, an ad that is genuinely entertaining in its own right, like literally all those written by Dennis, who is in fact a god among mere mortals when it comes to writing advertisements, is generally going to be far more successful than an ad that isn't, even if the latter has a bigger push behind it. For an example on the YouTube side, we again point you to Linus Tech Tips video in which the entire thing is one big continual segue to a different sponsor and is, in fact, one of the most entertaining videos they have ever produced, and according to commentary on The WAN Show, also apparently one of their most profitable ever, as you might expect from the fact that the video has about a dozen sponsors. And on top of that, the entire video is monetized with built-in YouTube ads to boot, an absolute masterclass in entertaining advertising. On the more mainstream side, we have, for example, the 2016 Deadpool movie, which for a time felt like it was everywhere. In reality, though, the marketing budget for that movie was relatively modest, with Ryan Reynolds handling much of the publicity personally to keep costs down. For example, it was Reynolds who suggested a billboard marketing Deadpool as a romantic movie, noting that they created a billboard featuring him and my celebrity crush my wife is totally okay with because she crushes on her too in Morena Baccarin. All with flowery text over the billboard advertising the film's projected Valentine's Day premiere, another deliberate choice. To save even more money, Reynolds only asked the studio for enough money to rent a single billboard for the shortest time allowed by the billboard owner. His thinking being that they'd only need a single billboard to make the joke, and that as soon as someone with a couple million followers on social media, like say the Sexiest Man Alive award winner Ryan Reynolds, who I think we can all admit, regardless of normal preferences, definitely gay for Reynolds, shared that billboard online, well, fans would share it for free without the studio having to pay for the rest. Reynolds has since become well known for this sort of thing to the point that he has created his own company specifically to handle the advertising for projects he's involved with, generally making the advertisements for these projects highly entertaining. Ever on brand, this company is called Maximum Effort and describes itself in a similar irreverent tone, with the company's about page consisting of a single paragraph which reads as follows: Maximum Effort makes movies, TV series, content, ads, and cocktails for the personal amusement of Hollywood star Ryan Reynolds. We occasionally release them to the general public. Of course, not everything Maximum Effort has released has been as successful as the advertising for Deadpool, but it has been notably cheaper than the traditional way of advertising, which generally allows not only a lot more leeway in terms of what would be considered successful, but also for the company to create more ads with their budget, leading to a shotgun approach, usually involving at least one thing that will go viral, in effect putting the effort of advertising the product onto the consumer, who themselves don't usually mind sharing what is ultimately an ad, largely because it's entertaining. And hey, all maximum profitable for Reynolds, as if his movies do better, he gets paid more in future projects and more likely to be cast, and he's now also getting paid to advertise the movies to help them do better. He is definitely playing life with cheat codes enabled. In the end, once again, it's not so much ads we don't like, it's just that they tend to suck, are boring, and most egregious of all, interrupt our actual entertainment, which we just want to be entertained. In some sense, a good episode of any piece of media is, in turn, an advertisement for itself that way. It's all about just being entertaining. As for consumers doing the advertising for Reynolds' agency, our favorite example of this is when Reynolds himself claimed to have leaked the entire Detective Pikachu movie in which he played the title character online, with the link leading to nothing but an hour-and-a-half long video of Pikachu dancing to synthwave. This was a video that was viewed by about 40 million people. Noteworthy, that was about half what the actual official trailer released by Warner Brothers, which had 78 million views at the time of writing, ended up getting, all with something an animator probably threw together in an afternoon. The problem with this approach is that while it is cheaper, it requires something that, with some notable exceptions we've worked with, many advertisers and marketing people don't really tend to have in great abundance: creativity. And even when a given team does have that, they answer to bosses who often don't, and they all answer to legal, who ruin everything in advertising and entertainment. But to be fair, it is their job. The frustrating reality is that while these kinds of ads are more effective by almost every conceivable metric, make an ad funny or zany and people will like it, such ads take a not insignificant amount of effort to create, and advertisers tend to, on the whole, be against such things and freeform elements to their campaigns, again with some exceptions which we can attest to, where some agencies absolutely adore us getting silly and creative as we please with their sponsorship, so long as their legal teams don't object to any specifics. While lawyers do often have great sense of humors, the law does not have a sense of humor that we are aware of. Turns out pleading "it was a joke" isn't a valid option. The danger of this humor approach for the brands is, of course, getting silly with something almost certainly means someone, somewhere, is going to get offended, as not everyone has had life properly scar them to the point where they have to develop a healthy, knee-jerk, make a joke out of everything coping mechanism as God intended. Unfortunately from this, combined with that social media is literally designed and algorithmically optimized to manifest, spread, and profit from anger, anxiety, and controversy, whether in a given case anything about the controversy is accurate or not, people getting offended by something is something brands try to avoid like the plague, despite that we'd argue that this is counterproductive on the whole on a number of levels. But either way, all resulting in the blandest, most boring, and forgettable advertisements possible. But going back to Reynolds, another thing that makes some of the examples of his agency's gimmicks work and how they spread organically is the perception of authenticity they present. One of the most effective forms of advertising is word of mouth. Of course, this is a double-edged sword because they can advertise a movie all they want, but if one person you know says it sucks, you're probably not going to watch that movie, unless that opinion is coming from Greg, who is, in fact, an idiot. As the Business News Daily notes on this matter, word of mouth is, by and large, something that simply cannot be bought in a paid ad. It can, however, be faked due to a quirk in how we see friends. You see, while word of mouth in regards to advertising generally refers to conversations with friends, family, and acquaintances, nestled in there are the relationship people form parasocially, say with celebrities or socially awkward YouTube personalities with the voice of a 12-year-old. Exactly what the difference would be between a recommendation made by a trusted friend and one made by such an individual in regards to someone's likelihood to buy a product is hard to quantify, but we do know that it works, with the rise of stuff like the worst moniker of all time that the person who coined it should definitely burn in hell for coming up with: influencers. So while in the past a celebrity endorsement could be used by a brand to build overall trust among consumers, with the thinking being that if consumers like a celebrity, or more aptly like a character or characters a celebrity plays, but the consumer has convinced themselves is like the actor themselves, those warm feelings of familiarity would extend to their product or service. In the digital age, people don't just like online influencers, They sometimes consider them to be, if not friends, someone they trust, often getting to know them on some level far better than traditional Hollywood celebrities who, when they open their mouths to give their opinions on things in social media, tend to do a bang-up job of showing that there is a vast difference between who they are as people and the characters they play, whose personalities and words were carefully crafted by often extremely talented writers. As such, when such an influencer makes a recommendation in our brains, it is almost indistinguishable, at least from an advertising effectiveness standpoint, from one being made by a friend or family member if said recommendation is made authentically. Which is the rub and the part advertisers really don't like because it simply does not gel with the way they often insist on their brand being portrayed. For an example of what we mean here, consider a video made by YouTuber Jenny Nicholson about the utter crap show that was the Star Wars Hotel. In the aftermath of the video's release, a rather interesting observation Nicholson made on social media was that a number of people criticizing her review very specifically chose to use the full, official name of the experience, Star Wars Galactic Star Cruiser, rather than just calling it the Star Wars Hotel or something like most everybody else online did. The end result being that no matter how authentically they tried to make their criticism sound, you could always tell that they weren't the writer's unfiltered personal opinions because only someone working for Disney or some agency Disney hired for PR would likely write it like that. This is similar to how when people drink soda in movies or TV shows, you can generally tell when the brand themselves requested the product placement because the actors have to hold the can in such a way that they never fully obscure the label. As for how this impacts ads, like the example of actors holding cans of Pepsi like a weirdo, you can usually tell when an ad isn't the influencer's own opinion or exact way they'd word something, because they'll suddenly start talking like an alien freshly arrived on Earth who only vaguely understands human social interactions and speech patterns. This isn't to say that advertisers won't still try to convince you that this is not the case, with YouTube ads, for example, often including clauses stating that an ad read should appear authentic. In fact, we can say that's pretty much in every single ad brief we've ever read, ironically enough, usually before including a pre-written example the creator can repeat verbatim. The really fun part of all of seeing so much of both sides of this is watching ultra-professionally produced advertisements on TV where they'll have an everyday bloke come on to tell you how much they love whatever product and their personal experience with it, all while using words that would never in a million years come out of any real human's mouth outside of when read from a script written by a marketer. Bonus points when the ad also says in small print that the alleged everyday person is a paid actor. Yeah, we know. Although going back to YouTube sponsorships, we are overgeneralizing. There are indeed quite a few sponsors out there, and more and more and more as the years pass, who are realizing that trying to control the way a YouTube personality pitches their product is a recipe for making the ad less effective and, in our case, many times a recipe for us to just say no thanks, even though we otherwise like the product, lest we wouldn't have gotten that far in the process.
Tend to be a bit like, can you just read the ad points? And I haven't done that. So, yeah. .com/brainfood is where you can...
So they're basically like, Simon, you're not very good at these ad reads.
Dude, I don't know. I can't help myself. It's like I see the points and I'm like, it doesn't sound like me. And I like...
Yeah.
And I know they're going to be like, you didn't mention this. And I'm like, yeah, but look, I actually like what you do. I feel like people listening might actually get that if you let me say like that I like what you do.
Yeah. But at the same time, to be fair, they probably have like marketing studies, and if you use these words, it's way more effective at the same time.
All right, look. Okay, so I could just say, drawing, writing, and journaling classes can be a great way to manage stress, practice mindfulness, and feel connected to one another, is something that would never exit my mouth. But saying that actually good and helps you learn stuff, and you can dive in and like learn stuff about things I actually do, like podcasting, then I'd be like, okay, people might actually go and get it because he actually likes it.
In fact, we've had a few advertisers who very explicitly gave us completely free reign to do literally whatever we wanted as long as we mentioned the link and promo associated at some point. In one case, in a certain sponsorship done by yours truly, I thought the product was absolutely hilarious and Simon would never touch it with a 10-foot pole, but I was totally on board with promoting it. but given the nature of the product, only explicitly if they'd both agree to let me make the ad completely zany and say and do literally whatever I wanted with zero regards to their brief. Shockingly, the brand agreed sight unseen as to what I wanted to do, and it ended up being one of our best and most popular sponsorships to date, in our opinion, because it was both highly entertaining and fully authentic sounding because I was allowed to be fully authentic. Also, it was a hilarious natural fit for our demographic. But going back to weirdly held soda cans in films, fortunately for consumers, there are some rules in place to prevent advertisers tricking you. For example, beyond laws which vary from nation to nation pertaining to such, YouTube and Instagram have rules in place dictating that ads need to be disclosed as such. Even then, advertisers and crappier content creators can avoid this by doing stuff like burying the ad disclosure in the description of a video or putting #ad in between a bunch of other hashtags on Instagram. A favorite tactic of many an Instagram influencer. On that note, and back to TV, everything we've discussed so far applies almost exclusively to the United States, with places like the UK having somewhat more hard regulations on how many ads can appear per hour of content, which of course advertisers endlessly complain about because they won't be happy until they can make us wear those headsets shown in the Ready Player One movie that are specifically calibrated to show just enough ads not to cause a seizure. Of course, to be fair in all of this, when talking about online creators who get paid an insanely small fraction of what the big boys get for sponsorships, despite us often producing far better and vastly more trackable results, for many of us, sponsorships are essential to keep the lights on at all. Today I found out no exception. In fact, the vast majority of videos we make lose money, sometimes laughably large amounts, and it's only our Patreon and YouTube members, along with the sponsorships for a subset of the videos and the occasional video that pops off views-wise, why we can make any of these videos. In the end, sponsorships are essential for most to keep doing this at all and creating the content from countless channels we all enjoy. So yeah, pros and cons. On that note, check out our Patreon and YouTube memberships, everybody. We cannot stress enough how essential those support outlets are to this channel. And now how about a bonus fact? One piece of media networks often have trouble figuring out a way to run ad against is the film Schindler's List. While networks have in the past suggested it's because they respect the artistic vision of Spielberg and the history being told, the real reason is that few companies are willing to run ads against a Holocaust movie, something we can similarly attest with some brands being uninterested in sponsoring any of our similarly themed videos, despite their extreme educational value, and that they often perform the best. That said, there are exceptions, and for example, a few advertisers have given us large latitude to do what we want in the sponsor spots and put them in whatever video we think is best. For example, our 2-hour-long documentary, Swept Under the Rug: The Truth About the Japanese Holocaust, was not just demonetized, but also age-restricted, despite being an incredibly in-depth and, we'd argue, important piece of history for everyone to learn about for so many reasons. Despite content matter in that video which made what Schindler's List depicts seem tame, one sponsor in Bespoke Post was willing to approve their sponsorship going in that video. Given the length of the video and the work that went into it, it still lost money, but at least wasn't a total money sink. And I do think to this day one of the best videos we've ever produced, with seemingly viewers thinking so as well, as it ended up so far nearing 300,000 views, many times the norm for even the best of age-restricted videos. Then there's the like of our longtime and most flexible sponsor on all fronts, whose primary goal is not to advertise a product for sale, but to promote education and tell the interesting stories in their history in an entertaining and fully accurate way, to be used in their schools as well, the historic city of Quincy, Massachusetts. They are, in fact, our favorite sponsor because they both nail the professional side of things, but also working with them closely personally for years now, a great group of humans and so passionate about both history and education, to the extent that there exists a rather lengthy years-long text and email and occasional dinner topic thread between us all debating what US president would win in a battle royale style fight among all the other US presidents. Definitely Lincoln or Teddy Roosevelt, fight me on it. But going back to Schindler's List and their struggle to get major advertisers on board, one notable exception is Ford, who in 1997 paid $10 million to exclusively sponsor a showing of the film on NBC. This ran without embedded ads, but was sandwiched between two specially made commercials for Ford. Despite being a massive success, more people tuned in than had watched the movie in cinemas, 65 million to 25 million, and garnering extra publicity for Ford sponsoring the showing in such a unique way, and the viewing experience being top-notch compared to most movies shown on network TV back then, the experiment has not really been replicated since on network TV, although in the modern world of streaming, this format has more or less become the default, with promotions of some sort before and after the main content is streamed.